Take a look at this graph. So on the y-axis, you see a measure of a country's religiosity, which is the proportion of people in the country that say that religion is a very important part of their lives. And on the x-axis, you see a measure of the nation's wealth, in this case, GDP per capita. Now you can see that there's a remarkably robust negative relationship, that the wealthier a country gets, the less religious it is. But there are outliers. One of these outliers is China. Now China is one of, if not the biggest economy in the world, but because it has such a large population, its GDP per capita is not where the rich countries of Europe or say the United States are. Despite that though, its religiosity is way below any of those countries. Now that can be easily explained by some cultural historical events in China. Specifically, the Mao regime saw religion as a colonial tool and basically made religion illegal. Now after Mao's death, that position softened, but even still, a lot of survey companies will be uncomfortable with asking people in China about their religion, and it might be the only country in the world where people are more likely to falsely claim that they're non-religious rather than the other way around. Now another outlier is Kuwait. Kuwait is a very rich country, but also a very religious country. The reason for that is because of the peculiar demographic makeup of the country. The actual number of native Kuwaitis is actually very small, and they happen to be very rich. But the majority of the country is made up by expatriates, who tend to be less wealthy, and they tend to be pretty devout Muslims or Christians or Hindus or Buddhists. But perhaps the most interesting outlier on this chart is the United States. Unlike its European counterparts, which have seen this trend whereby as they get richer and more literate and more highly educated, they get less religious, the United States stands out. Why? Well, one provocative idea is that the United States doesn't actually stand out in terms of real religiosity. Could it be that surveys about religion are actually picking up a case of the emperor wearing no clothes? In other words, is it the case that people in the United States claim that they're religious because they believe, erroneously, that everyone else is religious? Well, there's some interesting data to support that point. So one example is research by sociologists who find substantial response biases, which is biases in how openly and honestly people respond to their questions in terms of religiosity, and in particular in terms of religious attendance. Given that religious attendance is an actual behavior that people actually do, you can measure the discrepancy between what people say they do and what they actually do. So for example, if you say, how frequently do you go to church? And people say every week, and then you ask them, did you go to church last Sunday? You find that the number is lower. If you actually do head counts of people who say that they went to church last Sunday, you find that the actual number is lower than the number who said they did. And if you ask people about their church attendance in relatively more anonymous situations, so for example, if you do a face-to-face interview or a telephone interview where somebody has to respond directly to another human being versus answering anonymously on the internet, you find that when people answer on the internet, they are 50% more likely to say that they never or rarely attend church than if they were to answer the interview on the phone. Now, one interesting thing about the survey work on response biases and religious attendance is that you tend to see this exaggeration about attendance in the United States, and you tend to see it in Canada, but you don't tend to see it in places where religion is less normative, like in Europe. So what you might be seeing is that in the United States, there's a much higher tendency of people to over-report how religious they are relative to how religious they actually are. And this is consistent with the work that we saw earlier by Will Gervais, where he found that in the United States, it's not just that people over-report their religious attendance, but they seem to be over-reporting their actual religious belief. And so it might be the case that the US, when we talk about actual levels of religiosity, not just reported levels of religiosity, might not be an outlier. But there are other explanations. For example, a number of theorists have dug deep into America's colonial history to note that a lot of the earliest Europeans to have come over tended to be very religious, and that set a tone for the ensuing centuries. But that answer seems a little unsatisfying. There were a lot of countries that were very religious in the 18th century and have become quite secular now. Moreover, it's not as if the United States has been consistently very religious. It's gone through these waves of declines and revivals. So I think we need more of an explanation. One of the other ideas that's often talked about goes back to one of the founding ideological principles of the United States, which is the principle of the freedom of religion. So these theorists argue that it was ironically the separation between church and state and the ability for people to be free to choose whatever religion they wanted or no religion that actually kept levels of religiosity so high across American history. The idea here is that this free market of competing religions almost always provided some religion which fit the particular spiritual hunger that different people had. So it was America's willingness to tolerate various types of religion and various types of expression of religion that allowed religiosity to stay high, whereas religiosity often declined quite sharply in countries where there was only a single state-sponsored official religion. But this theory has its own challenges, and one of the biggest is that some of the most religious countries in the world tend to have only one state-sanctioned official religion, Islam.
Hallelujah. I don't care what you're going through. There's nothing too hard that God can't do for you. There's nothing that you've been in, nothing that you've done, that God can't forgive you.
So despite all these interesting hypotheses, the question remains, why does some place like America, despite having a very similar culture to a place like Canada, end up so much more apparently religious? Some, like John Landman, have used the credibility enhancing display theory to explain why you've seen religion decline in places like Northern Europe especially, and why that decline has eluded the United States. His argument is that in places like, say, Sweden, there was an economic bubble which affected everybody in the country, regardless of position in the hierarchy, and that led life to be easier across the board. When that economic bubble occurred, people found less necessity for religious rituals and religious attendance. Children of that generation who did not see their parents engage in the religious acts that signal commitment to faith then didn't become religious themselves. Not seeing the credibility enhancing displays that empirical work shows drive the belief in God, those children found it very easy to not believe in God at all. Now contrast that with what was going on in the United States. The United States is a much, much more unequal and difficult place to live despite its high GDP. The reason for that is because it lacks the type of social safety net that you see in, say, Canada, or especially in places like Northern and Western Europe. Without that safety net, there was always the risk that you could fall considerably. As a result, religion provided a form of psychological safety net, something that wasn't necessary in places which had a physical economic safety net. This explanation is actually rooted in the unique political origins of the United States. The United States, unlike a lot of countries, was built fundamentally on the rejection of government. That's made it suspicious of large government throughout its history. Now, we've talked a couple times so far about the interchangeable role that religions and governments can play. So we talked about this in our discussion of different routes to large-scale cooperation. One route is the deterrence value of supernatural punishment, but another route is the deterrence value of secular institutions. We also talked about this in the work of Aaron Kay on the compensatory control model. There, God and government serve as these interchangeable ways, both of which are able to ease our sense of existential insecurity that comes with a lack of personal autonomy. So now take a look at this chart. This is much like the chart we saw at the top of this lecture, with religious importance on the y-axis, but instead of GDP per capita on the x-axis, we're instead looking at the percentage of GDP that is expended by the government. So poor countries with weak governments, but with high commitment to religion, cluster towards the top left of the graph, whereas modern and secular welfare states, like the Scandinavian countries, cluster to the bottom right. But unlike the graph we saw earlier, here the United States is not an outlier. In fact, here it sits directly on the trend line. Among the grand scheme of countries, though America is exceptionally rich, it has a moderately sized government and a moderately high level of religiosity. All right, so let's recap. Why has the United States ended up this great outlier in terms of its high levels of religiosity? The several explanations we talked about are: 1. Social pressure leading people to overreport how religious they actually are. 2. The country historically being seeded by exceptionally religious people. 3. The free market theory of competing religions. And 4, and I think this is the best explanation, the threat and vulnerability that comes with the absence of a strong welfare state. Now, as you may recall, despite all these factors which have kept religiosity high in America, American religiosity is nonetheless now on an unmistakable decline. That's what we're going to talk about next lecture.